My name is Emily Carter, and I was 18 years old the night my father destroyed the one thing I had worked for my entire life. The acceptance letter sat on the dinner table beside the mashed potatoes and gravy. By the time the meal was over, it was ripped into two jagged pieces. My father said that no daughter of his was going to waste money on college, even though the scholarship covered everything. My mother stared at her plate. My brother stayed silent, and I sat there holding the torn pieces of my future, while the kitchen clock ticked like nothing had happened. What none of us realized that night was that my grandmother had been watching, quietly, patiently, and she had been preparing for this moment far longer than any of us knew. We lived in a white farmhouse at the end of Miller Road, a place where every coat had a hook and every person had a role. My father sat at the head of the table. My mother sat to his right. My younger brother, Luke, sat across from her. I sat wherever there was room left, usually closest to the kitchen so I could refill glasses, clear plates, and keep the peace whenever tension started building. At the far end of the table sat my grandmother, Eleanor Carter. She was 78, straight-backed, and almost always quiet. My father talked over her so often that most people forgot she was even there. I used to think she liked the seat by the window because it was peaceful. Years later, I understood that she had never needed the head of the table to control the room. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in April. I stood at the mailbox reading it for times before I let myself believe it. Full engineering scholarship, tuition paid, housing paid. A university 300 miles away with one of the best robotics labs in the state. I had done it all alone. I filled out applications at the public library because the computer at home belonged to my father. I wrote essays in a notebook and typed them in short sessions before the library closed. I asked my physics teacher for a recommendation and kept the whole process secret because I was afraid someone would crush it before it had a chance to live. Walking home that day, I felt something I had not felt in years: hope. Not just hope for college. Hope that maybe, finally, my father would be proud of me. I imagined setting the letter on the table and watching his face change. I imagined him seeing that the quiet daughter who carried dishes had built something important all by herself. I had spent 18 years trying to be useful enough, good enough, invisible enough to earn that look from him. At dinner, I waited until everyone had started eating. My mother had made pot roast, my father's favorite. Luke was talking about a truck he wanted someday. Grandma Eleanor was cutting her carrots into tiny, perfect squares. I slid the letter onto the table beside my father's plate. "I got some news," I said. He kept eating. "I applied to State University for engineering. They gave me a full scholarship. Tuition, housing, everything. It won't cost you a dime." My mother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Luke looked up immediately. My father finally picked up the letter and read it. For a single second, I thought I saw pride flicker across his face. Then his jaw tightened. "Engineering," he said flatly. 300 miles away. "It a full ride, Dad, I earned it." Grandma Eleanor stopped cutting her carrots. My mother whispered, "Roy." My father held the letter between two fingers and looked at me like I had forgotten my place. "No daughter of mine is wasting money on school." Then he tore the letter in half. He did it slowly, making sure everyone saw. The paper made a soft ripping sound, the kind you hear when opening a grocery receipt. Such a small sound for something that felt like an explosion. He dropped the two pieces beside the potatoes and picked up his fork. "You stay here," he said, "learn to run a house, find a decent man. That worth more than some degree you never use." My mother looked down, Luke looked down, nobody said a word. I felt something inside me go cold and quiet, and the part one still struggled to forgive myself for is this. I didn't fight back. I didn't shout, I didn't stand up. I didn't tell him he had no right. I said I'm sorry. That was my instinct after 18 years in that house. Apologize. Smooth things over. Make everyone comfortable. I gathered the torn pieces of my acceptance letter and said, "Sorry for ruining dinner." My father nodded, satisfied. My mother relaxed. Luke went back to talking about his truck, and I carried the dishes to the sink because that was what I had always done. Later that night, I sat at my desk and taped the letter back together, carefully, patiently, like I was trying to mend a broken bone. That was when I noticed the deadline near the bottom: enrollment confirmation and deposit due by May 1st. I checked the calendar, April 20th. 10 days. The scholarship covered tuition and housing, but not the deposit, the dorm key fee, or the bus ticket. I counted my savings from babysitting. $311 not enough. For the next few days I tried everything. I applied for jobs at the diner, the hardware store, and the grocery store. I asked if anyone could pay me immediately. I looked into a small loan and learned very quickly that banks do not trust 18-year-old girls with no credit and no cosigner. Every door seemed locked. One night, I found myself crying quietly in the laundry room. My mother walked in, saw me and sighed. "You are making your father miserable," she said. "He has not slept over this college thing." I stared at her. "Mom, he tore up the one thing I ever." "You upset the whole house, Emily." That was the moment I realized she was going to save me. Nobody in that house was. That night, I pulled an old suitcase from the back of my closet and packed it. 2 pairs of jeans, my good sweater, my physics textbook, socks, underwear, a small photo of my grandfather, and my acceptance letter was taped together and tucked into the inside pocket. I was not planning to run away. I was preparing for the possibility that I might have to leave with nowhere to go. When I finished, I slid the suitcase under my bed and lay awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time in my life, I felt something stronger than hope, readiness. And 2 days later, my grandmother found the suitcase. "Good," she said quietly. "A woman should always be able to leave a room." Then, she pushed the suitcase farther into the shadows and added, "Keep your seat at the dinner table a little longer. Emily, there is something I want you to see." I had no idea that those words were about to change my life forever. 2 days later, my grandmother came into my room carrying 2 cups of tea. She had never done that before. Usually she kept to herself, speaking only when something truly mattered. She handed me one of the cups, sat on the edge of my bed, and waited without saying a word. Most people filled silence because it made them uncomfortable. Grandma Eleanor used silence like an invitation. After a few minutes, I found myself telling her everything. I talked about the university, the engineering program, the robotics lab, the scholarship, and the deposit I could not afford. I even admitted how badly I wanted my father to believe in me, even after everything that had happened. Instead of giving me sympathy, she surprised me with questions. She asked about bridge design, structural loads, and why engineering fascinated me so much. It felt like she genuinely cared about my answers. Nobody in my family had ever asked me about my dreams before. When I finished explaining the deadline and the amount I needed, she simply nodded as though she were memorizing every detail. Before leaving, she stopped at the doorway. "Your grandfather always believed the greatest investment a family could make was in a curious mind," she said softly. "He was wrong about many things, but never about that." The next afternoon I was walking home after another failed job application when I noticed my grandmother leaving a law office downtown. She carried a thick cream-colored envelope against her chest with unusual care before boarding the bus home. She never saw me standing across the street. I had no idea why an elderly woman who supposedly owned nothing would need a lawyer, but something about the moment stayed with me. That evening my father once again talked about the future during dinner. He proudly told my younger brother that one day the family business, the house, and all the land would belong to him, because that was simply how families worked. I looked toward my grandmother. She quietly finished cutting her carrots into perfect little squares and said nothing. Yet I caught the faintest hint of a smile before she lowered her eyes back to her plate. The countdown to my deadline continued. 8 days became 7, then 6. One afternoon my mother found me crying in the laundry room again. Instead of comforting me, she told me I was making life difficult for my father. She said he was only trying to protect me from disappointment. That conversation finally broke something inside me. That night I packed my suitcase completely. I folded every piece of clothing carefully and placed my repaired acceptance letter inside one of the pockets. If my father forced me to leave, I wanted to be ready. A couple of days later my grandmother noticed the suitcase beneath my bed. She smiled. "Good." I expected her to tell me to unpack it, but instead she pushed it farther under the bed so nobody else would notice. "Every woman should always have the ability to leave a room when she chooses," she said. "Keep your bag packed but stay through one more dinner, trust me." I had no idea what she meant, but something in her voice made me believe her. With only 4 days remaining before the deadline, I made one last attempt to convince my father. I wrote down every number on a sheet of paper. The scholarship, the costs, the average engineering salary. I placed it in front of him after dinner. "Please just read it," I said. He actually did. For a brief moment I thought facts might succeed where emotions had failed. Then he laughed. He pushed the paper back toward me. "A woman engineer will spend her life proving herself to men who will never take her seriously," he said. "Better to build a family than chase a fantasy." I folded the paper, thanked him for listening, and carried it upstairs. That was the last time I ever asked for his permission. The following evening I almost called the university to decline my scholarship. My finger hovered over the final button on the phone while I listened to the automated menu. Then I remembered my grandmother's words, "Stay for one more dinner," so I hung up. That decision changed everything. Later that night my grandmother entered my room carrying the same cream-colored envelope I had seen outside the law office. She closed the door behind her. "Emily, it's time you learned the truth about this family." I listened carefully. "When your grandfather passed away 20 years ago, he never left this house to your father." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked directly into my eyes. "Everything belongs to me. The house, the land, the business, every single piece of it." I could barely breathe. My father had spent my entire life acting like he owned everything. Every decision, every rule, every inch of that property. "He owns nothing," my grandmother continued calmly. "I allowed him to believe he did because I wanted to see what kind of man he would become when he thought nobody could stop him." She paused. "Now I know." She placed her hand gently on the cream envelope. "For months I have been working with an attorney. Everything has been arranged." Then she looked at me with more warmth than I had ever seen. "But before I do anything, I need to know something. If I offered you this entire house tomorrow, would you take it?" I thought about the question for a long time. Then I shook my head. "No, I do not want revenge. I do not want to replace Dad at the head of that table. I only want the chance to build my own life." For the first time in my life, my grandmother smiled without holding anything back. "That was the answer I hoped you would give." She stood and walked toward the door. "Tomorrow night," she said, "bring your suitcase downstairs. Sit at the table. Say nothing. Leave the talking to me." Then she quietly closed the door behind her. And for the first time since my father tore my future apart, I went to sleep believing that maybe my story was not over after all.